Hey friends, I have a favor to ask you. I've embedded captions in this video. Can you let me know whether or not you like those? They're a little bit more accurate than the ones that YouTube provides. Put a thumbs up or a thumbs down in the comments to let me know. Here's my conversation with Kristin. We're going to talk about the Beth Allison Barr Theology Lab episode, and we're going to share our own stories about why we changed our minds on the topic of women in ministry.
While you can find evidence of what I would prefer to call patriarchy in the Bible has a lot of patriarchy in it because it was written in a patriarchal world. But it also has evidence of what I would consider to be this counter narrative to patriarchy. And you cannot faithfully represent the Bible by telling only one of those stories.
We have Scott Rice and Kristin Lee here. And to kick it off, what stood out to you from that conversation with Beth? What are you still thinking about afterwards?
One of the things that I found very interesting was how Beth advocates for holding the tensions that exist in the Bible, and not overlooking them, or not trying to squash them. So, for example, she says that you can't write out the household codes, but neither can you write out Deborah, the existence of Deborah, the judge. And so I think it introduces this measure of humility to both sides of an argument, whether it's about complementarianism or other divides that we have. If both sides can acknowledge that those tensions exist and not try to write them out, I think that we could have much more productive conversations that way.
It's great. How about you, Scott?
So I think I have a similar reflection. I think, Chris and I, when we were setting up the questions, there was a reason we talked so much. We put so many questions to Beth about like interpreting the Bible, and Beth, I was like so pleased by how much she jumped onto those questions. And my response to this question is almost the same to what Kristin has said. And so I'll just try to add something onto it. I appreciated that Beth named honestly the contradictions that we find, the different voices you find about women within the Bible itself. There's like just an honesty to being able to speak to that I feel like, in the tradition I've kind of come out of, it wasn't didn't always feel okay to say that. So I appreciated that she named, right? There's voices and then counter voices, narratives or counter narratives. So when I read passages like 1 Timothy 2, for example, right? And I know that there are takes on that passage that want to say, if you look at it in context, you have a different meaning. But you take that passage, you take these other passages, and I begin to wonder, like it feels like we may be doing some kind of special pleading here. So be able to say, all right, so Scripture can speak in a way where the kind of patriarchy of the time in the text comes through. But then there's also these other stories, and she mentioned so many. Like she mentioned Junia and Phoebe. The one that is really powerful to me, right, is thinking about the resurrection of Jesus, and then that he tells the female disciples who are at the tomb to go and to tell the story first. They are the first people to proclaim the gospel. I think that's really powerful. So I think the part that I'm now it has me reflecting on is, right. You have these two different voices, but then so what? Does that just mean like they're two different equal options? And I don't think so. That's where I think you have to do something like theology and say, now I have to interpret these different voices in light of what? I think I look at that as I interpret those in light of the larger story of Scripture. I interpret those. I can't get around the fact I belong to a tradition and how that tradition has understood the gospel. Which one of those seems like it's really good news? Which one lines up with experiences that I've seen? I think maybe we'll be able to get into that one a little bit more. But I think I appreciate the way that Beth is able to kind of push forward this question that asks us, how do I read Scripture? How do I make decisions when there's these different voices within the Bible itself?
And Scott, you've hinted that not only is it in Scripture, but it's in the very traditions that it certainly exist today, but also that you've been raised in. Maybe for both of you, have you actually wrestled with that theologically, the tension around complementarian, egalitarian, the role of women in the church, in the Bible? How have you personally wrestled with that over time?
I'll jump in on this one. There was a point in my life, a long period of my life, where I would have embraced complementarian views about about gender, about a reading of the Bible. And, Beth defines complementarianism, right? And she gives a definition in the interview itself. I'm going to say like it's a take in which women are dependent upon men in some kind of one-way relationship where like the man is not dependent upon the woman. That's I don't know, maybe that's helpful or maybe it's not. But there was a time that I would have endorsed complementarianism, and my mind changed on that. And I think about what that process was like. Interestingly, like early on, I had two key influences in my early faith life. One was a church when we actually did have we had a woman that was a pastor, a lead pastor of our church. But at that point in my life, I was actually much more influenced by a large parachurch evangelical ministry, and in which they didn't really have like a specific view on this, but there was a lot of complementarianism there, and I think that really formed me. But interestingly, years later, being on staff for that same ministry, I saw all of these women doing incredible work and leading and preaching. That left an impression on me for sure, even as I probably would have said I was still a complementarian. And then I remember being in seminary. It was like the first year, and that's where like theologically I was wrestling with a lot of the things that Beth brought up in this interview. And in realizing like, well, this is really complicated. And I'm seeing the different voices on the topic of the role of women in the Bible itself and thinking, all right, is my mind changing? Although I do remember once talking to a friend and just saying like, and being in the midst of this, like, I'm like, is my mind changing on this? I don't know. And saying to him, and like, I'm really struggling with this. And it feels like people who hold a different, maybe a more progressive view for me than this, I really struggled with what felt like a lack of clarity on their side. Whereas like my more conservative view had this like very specific
Mm,
view and being pulled back and
mm,
forth. That gives me some sympathy. And then I will tell you, my mind changed. There was a point in which just I think all those impressions of how gifted women were in ministry that I had seen around me, and then how this was way more complicated in reading the Bible and thinking theologically than was led to believe. So I can't figure out what it was. There was exactly in time. I can think within like a 1 or 2 year frame, but my mind just changed on it. And that's, uh, and I'm, and I'm grateful for that. That's been a gift. Kristin, I'd be curious, what about your story?
yeah, I was raised to think that being obedient to Jesus meant not questioning. And so I think as a kid, even through high school, I just unthinkingly absorbed all the theology I was given, and part of that was a complementarian theology. The youth group I attended was affiliated with the Southern Baptist tradition. I was like doing journal entries about biblical manhood and womanhood. Like I wanted to be a good Christian. Um, so I didn't really think about it until when I started thinking more broadly about the questions that I had about my faith in college and later years. And I couldn't ignore the questions anymore. And part of that was this complementarian theology. And for me, what really changed me was in medical school, working alongside incredible female surgeons and emergency room doctors and ICU doctors, and being like, why would you be able to put your life into the hands of a female oncologist on Monday, but then not want to hear her spiritual wisdom on a Sunday? Like there was this really jarring dissonance for me there, um, where it was very self-evident to me that women and men, maybe there's some differences, but really to me not. Like I couldn't really see those differences intellectually, spiritually, on wisdom level, and so it didn't make sense to me that women were barred from the pulpit in some traditions. So I think, and I am a very intuitive person, so I won't say that I was like digging into scripture to try to figure this out, but it was more just a gut a gut sensation after knowing these amazing female leaders.
Mm. It sounds like in both cases, a personal experience really began to shape how you engage with this theological question, which before was sort of unquestioned, an unquestioned complementarianism, whereas your lived experience forced you to kind of reevaluate that to where you both are today. One thing I'm wondering is, what's something that you're currently in line with sort of what Beth Allison Barr was talking about? What are some ongoing reflections or questions that you have in light of what she was speaking about?
Something that I'm still thinking about from our conversation with Beth was that she puts forward this thesis that it's because we don't know our history that
Mm.
people like Al Mohler are able to say things like there's this 2,000-year unbroken church history where the office of pastor is limited to men, something like that. And she said he would never be able to get away with that statement unchallenged if people actually knew our history and knew that there have been women leaders in church, in churches throughout history. So history for me is really important. Like knowing my personal history has become something really important to me in adulthood, and then also just knowing world history collectively, because I do think it influences how we think about really big issues like racial justice or international relations if we know our history appropriately. And so one lingering question for me is how do we make sure we teach accurate history well, not
Yeah.
only in our schools, but also in our churches?
My lingering thought is going to be Kristin's quote from earlier that what does it look like when you're taking advice from your oncologist and she's telling you about how to proceed with the diagnosis on a Monday, but on Sunday you're not open to her spiritual wisdom. That's a pretty incredible statement. Um, and the thing I'm going to be continuing to think about is just how far a little bit can go. I think for right, a lot of us, we say church history. It's like, okay, there were some early councils, a guy named Augustine, a Reformation, and then there's our church in the present. And in that very bare bones history, um, women, the names of women just rarely ever surface, at least in the bare bones version like that. So I think about like attention, giving attention, right, to more women. What does it look like to have like images and pictures around us of women from church history that can remind us? This is just like something I'm thinking about on the spot, but I will say on the flip side of the laptop from which I'm recording this, I have two stickers, and one of them is of a figure that was really important to me during graduate school. I ended up doing some studies on named Robert Jensen, but then intentionally next to him is Julian of Norwich, and part of it is because as much as I love Robert Jensen, Julian of Norwich just spoke with, I think, a certain boldness, maybe an equal boldness to Jensen's, where she still uses the male language around Father, Son, Spirit to talk about God, but also that Jesus is our mother, and she brought motherhood language into her talk about God. So, how much does that shape me? I don't know, but it does sit there as a little reminder about different voices that I want to be hearing and that should shape me as a follower of Jesus.
I love that. It's such a great picture of a lot of the themes that Beth talked about.
Just want to say it's so good to be in the studio. I think this is the first time we've been in our online studio all together, hosting as hosts of Theology Lab. So I look forward to more of these conversations. Thanks for watching this Theology Lab video. If you're enjoying it, you can subscribe to the channel below, and you'll get more Theology Lab videos as soon as they're released.